As some of you probably know, I'm the proud owner of a couple of kids. What you might not know is one of them is a teenager, and the other is teetering on that teenage edge. So no surprise maybe, but they're at that age where they're asking difficult, sometimes embarrassing questions. And you guessed it, they're asking about over-center mechanisms. As a dad, it's my responsibility to leave uncomfortable questions to their mom. But then I thought, you know what? What? If they're asking questions, maybe you're asking questions too. This is an over-center mechanism. Isn't it beautiful? Okay, fine. It's not much of a mechanism, but we've got to start somewhere. Can't just dive into the deep end. Some context for this video. Over-centers, or over-center mechanisms for short, aren't really that complicated, to be honest. And they fall under the umbrella of bistable mechanisms. Mechanisms which only have two stable states, A or B, on or off, left or right. How hard can that be? It's only two, for crying out. Nonetheless, I've always found a beautiful elegance in them. They solve a lot of problems, simply. So, with that said, if you're as bi-curious as I am, well, you're gonna love this video. Let's take a closer look at exactly what's happening here. We've got sort of this upside down stick and a screw. That combination lets it rotate about that point. These two dowels here are just from keeping it from spinning around like a clock. They're just stops. Those will turn out to be very important and an integral part of this whole thing. Yeah, there's some sort of pseudo-stable state, a position right in the middle where you can kind of balance it, but that position can't be trusted. On either end, though, it is rock solid. As simple as that seems to us now, you might be surprised to learn that it wasn't until like 1687 that people realized it was gravity that made this thing work. And only 50 years after that did they realize that it doesn't work upside down. It's useless now. What's going on here, to state the obvious, is that gravity is holding that link up against these stops. If I can manage to animate a little arrow in here, that's gravity trying to do its thing and pulling it down against the stops. So we've got a force going on here that's pulling the link up against the end stops. That doesn't do such a great job when it's upside down. Gravity's still doing its thing, but now our end stops are up here. What we need is some other force that's not going to depend on direction. Maybe you see where this is going. Do you know what this is? It's a spring. This is a spring. This does not rely on gravity. Is that not just the coolest thing you've ever seen? Yeah, I could have used a countersunk screw in the middle, so I'm not running into that spring. Now we've got that spring force always in the direction sort of making the link hit the hard stops and pulling that link over center. And we can now use this really cool mechanism any way we want. Upside down, sideways, backwards. Heck, even in the cold, heartless vacuum of space where there is no gravity. Odds are you've probably started to recognize this thing. These are absolutely everywhere. Maybe you recognize it as the kickstand of your bicycle, that cupboard that keeps itself open, or even that light switch on your wall. I wasn't going to do this, build a mechanism with a gas spring, but with this 30-pound gorilla in the room, you'd be remiss not to. Or I would. Somebody'd go missing anyway. Although gas springs like these are usually used to assist, say, lifting a heavy door, we can use it for an over-center mechanism. It'll be exactly like the extension spring we just used, but this works in compression. This spring pulls, and this one pushes. We'll build something crude around this. These come up a lot, and we'll just use it to talk through the process. Think of it like a homework problem. This little bugger, hardly over a ½ inch in diameter and, maybe 10 inches long, believe it or not, puts out a whopping 130 fig newtons of force, aka 13 kilograms, aka again around 30 pounds. I know it's a 30-pound cylinder because of that shiny black color. That and the label on the bag it came in. I'm not sure where these things come from. I assume they're mined out of the depths of hell. But these little marvels of engineering, and we could probably talk about these for days, have two key takeaways. First, this one's really important, they can be dangerous. These could knock your teeth out in a flash. And two, they are constant force. That means no matter how much I push them, that's 30 pounds. Still 30 pounds. Still 30 pounds. Just pause the video and think about that for a minute. A regular spring pushes back the more you push on it. Squish it a little, it pushes back a little. Double how much you squish it, and it'll push back double. This is constant. How on earth does it? Sorry about that. That was all sort of besides the point. I tend to go off on tangents sometimes. Meet the Finger Chopper 2000. Here I've got a little door mock-up. This could be a cabinet in your garage, a window maybe, a toolbox on your truck. It's not important. And what I want this box to do is stay open when it's open, all by itself, and stay closed when it's closed, all by itself. I'm going to use this gas. Basically, we want this mechanism to go over center. Let's think about this for a minute without the spring and talk about exactly what we want to happen. Well, when the door is down like this, when it's closed, we want a pulling force on the door keeping it closed. A clockwise torque around this hinge. We want it to keep moving clockwise. But when we open the box, when we lift the lid, we want the force to keep pushing it open. We now want this torque to go counterclockwise. When the door is open, we want it to keep pushing open. So your job here, should you choose to accept it, is to somehow install the spring so that it changes the side it pushes on, depending on where the door is. I mean, that sounds outright crazy when you say it out loud. Before we go twisting our brains into pretzels, I have a little problem to solve. I have no way to connect this gas spring. Right now, it's just got threaded studs on the end. Can you see that? Will that focus? I don't have what would be eyelets for this gas spring. So let's make a couple. First thing we need to know is that thread size. Going by the taste, these are M6 metric threads. If you're not a thread connoisseur like I am, you could use thread gauges to figure it out. Well, would you have a look at that? We've stumbled into a teachable moment. These parts should have been exactly the same, but in my haste, I made waste. Waste, we're going to use anyway. But check that out. I inadvertently switched to a different reference, which I thought was the same. I drilled the holes based on these shoulder locations, but I cut them to length based on the boss. Had these bosses been the same length, that would have been great, but they're not. I've ended up with a thin wall on the back of this eyelet. Now, since the gas springs are always in compression, the forces should always be pushing into this connector, into this eyelet, and I shouldn't risk blowing out that back wall. That, and I don't feel like making these again. That screws on there, that screws on there, and we're now well on our way to really hurting ourselves. To recap, we want to position the spring so that it sort of switches sides, or goes over center with the swing of the door. If I were to just attach the spring here, it's going to be trying to push the door open. And when it's in the up position, it's still going to be trying to push the door open. But if we look close, and this unfortunately is where my little mock-up door falls short, if we were to attach it to this side of the hinge, there's not enough material there. Here it would be pushing up clockwise, closing the door. But the geometry of the situation is such that when you toggle this, it sort of flips over to the other side and will be pushing it open. That's basically what we're trying to do. In a real door application, you probably wouldn't have a feature like this. You'd have just a regular hinge, probably somewhere else on the box. So to make up for that shortcoming, I'm just going to add a second tab down here somewhere. This might just be a gusset coming off the back of the door, or a bracket that came with your gas spring. Let me just take a moment. I don't know where this scrap metal has been, but you should be happy you're not around to smell this. This is a little bit thicker. It's going to throw my piston out of whack a bit, just because I needed enough thread engagement to not have this thing shoot across the shop. One thing you always want to keep in mind with these gas springs is that, apart from the force, now there's also sort of like a twisting motion at the mount point. Like when this goes under load, you see it's kind of like up higher from the hinge point. It's trying to twist this bolt out. And sometimes that mounting torque can be pretty severe. Here comes the scary part. I need to get this hole to line up with that threaded hole. And I'm going to do that with a clamp. Hopefully. I'm going to drop this on there just as a spacer. And I think that should be it. Let me clamp this down to the bench. All right, there's nothing in front of me should this piston take off that way, and it should miss my heart were it to come this way. Stays open. Stays closed. Open. Closed. If you just let out a squeal and thought to yourself, all right, now we're getting to the good stuff, well, let me know down in the comments. Maybe we can get a better group rate for therapy. Before I unveil what's inside this jar, let's just take another quick look at the two over-center mechanisms side by side. In both, we have a spring that's moving a link over the center of rotation and driving them up against the hard stop. You can think of both as sort of three links if you count the board that they're mounted on. There's the link, the spring, and the board. The link, the spring, and the board. Sorry if this one comes off screen, it's too big. Those three links make it a really strong and stable triangle shape. The only real difference is that this one is pulling the link over center, and this one is pushing the link over center. But for these to work, in either case, one of the three sides of the triangle had to change length to get from one position to the other. You follow that? With the gas spring, it needs to get shorter to clear that swing. With the extension spring, this spring needs to get longer. Again, think of it as a triangle. If one of those three lines can't change length, then nothing can move. And in both cases, that was the spring. In fact, springs are nice because they can create a force and change length. Some might even argue they create force because they change length, but who's to say? I'm sure we've all used these flip-top bottles and jars before. Up it opens, down it closes. But do you see a spring in there anywhere? Anything at all that could change length or develop a force? Well, let's have a closer look. I went out and bought the absolute cheapest jar I could find in the hopes that this would be very visible. And it looks like my $2 gamble paid off big time. Just look at how much those wires move. Sure, there's a rubber gasket in there, or something that looks like rubber, but it's a 1/16 of an inch at best. Way less than these pivots are moving. If these wires were wound a little better, a little tighter, this jar would never close. But let's look at what's happening mechanically. Out here is the hinge, where my sort of lever rolls around. The pivot for my link, in this case the part holding the lid closed, currently is sort of under and inside the hinge. When I pull this around, it swings under and up to the other side. And right there where you see sort of that most force happening is where it's flipping over center. There's the triangle we saw before. Because the pivot had to go over that center, the forces from these wires and that gasket are now pulling on one side or the other. In this case, they're pulling such that it's keeping the jar closed, up against the hard stop, in this case, the glass jar. Ever have your knee bend too far backwards and it locks up on you? Well, it's the same thing here. And fun fact, jars feel that same exact pain every time you close them. All the same parts as before, but arranged in a slightly different way and cleverly made with some bent wire, all to produce this functional latch. Or barely passable latch in this case. Here, however, there's one small but very important detail we didn't have to worry about in our spring versions. Check out this part of the link here, that short section. How long that link is determines how far over center we're trying to push this whole thing. Like the longer this little short section is, the more force we'll need. In this case, if it were longer, it would probably bind and you'd never get it to close without breaking it. If it were shorter, it'd be a heck of a lot easier to close, but you might not get a great seal. Easier to close, but it'd be a poop jar. I mean, not a poop jar, that's a different video. I mean very low quality. When used as a latch like this, over centers are absolutely everywhere. You probably know them from such popular films as tattered toolbox latches, beat up boot latches. Heck, even this barrel clamp I found accidentally mixed in with my nipple clamps uses just one big over center latch. I don't have much time with this one as my pants are already on their way to my ankles, but check out these suspender clamps. Can you guess what that is? Is it an overset? Well, it sure got chilly in here all of a sudden. Pretty smooth transition to locking clamps, eh? We've all used these clamps, right? I don't need to tell you that they just lock on when you squeeze them. No fooling around with finding the right size or running screws up and down like your grandpappy's C-clamps, right? Well, no, there's still a screw. You maybe don't directly tighten your work with this screw, but you need to set it for the thickness you're trying to clamp. Thickness and pressure, I guess. If you set these too tight, they're what? Can anybody guess? Anybody? That's right, they're too tight. I can't get them to lock on. I need to adjust them. So I'm just at that point where, what? Anybody? Anyone? Right again, you have to adjust them so the length inside can just snap over center. Now it's clamped on. The harder you make that link fight to snap over center, the more clamping force these will develop. It's not the easiest thing in the world to get a look inside here, so let's bring out its kissing cousin, the toggle clamp. These are exactly the same, but completely different. Let me just... On this toggle clamp, you can sort of see all of the links and the pivots, so it's just simpler to talk about. But both have a lever you move to clamp, and they both have a screw that needs adjusting. Just like these locking clamps, all that force that you generate squeezing the handle, or pushing the lever in this case, is transferred to the clamping, with some mechanical advantage sprinkled in, and they lock, keeping all that clamping force really bearing down. And just like that knee of yours that likes to bend backwards, no amount of force trying to lift this clamp will unlock this mechanism. The geometry changed, that pivot went over center, and now it's trying to rotate the wrong way if I try to open this clamp. It's just driving all that force back into itself, completely bound up, and nothing. You could put a 6-foot cheater bar under here, and nothing is going to get this lever to come back up, because it just physically can't. To break up the monogamy, let's walk through this one a little bit differently. It's exactly the same as everything else we've seen, but we'll use different words this time, though I still want my triangle. First thing you might notice is there's no spring here, but the fact that the clamp end can rotate means that the green line can change length. It can get longer. That green line also happens to be our quote-unquote center. Let's call it our center line. Now watch how, as I swing the lever, the top pivot goes past that center line. It goes over center. Not a lot. In this case, what might that be, 20, 30 thou? That's why these clamps can be finicky sometimes when you're adjusting them. Not a lot of margin, depending on what you're clamping, but it goes over center. It goes below that line. So who cares? Why is that so magical, you might be asking your loved ones? Well, this time let's look at the clamp back to front. Let's start at the clamp side this time. It's clamped down, squeezing something, which means what you're clamping is trying to push back. It's trying to open that clamp. So that clamping force is trying to rotate the clamp up, which in turn is pushing back on our handle. But look at that little link. It's now below the pivot point. So the pivot link is trying to move down, clockwise. It wasn't like that when we closed it, and it can't. It's run into the frame. And just like having too much Olive Garden, it's all bound up now. When we swung past center, we changed the geometry of the links, or how they can move, where they can move. And releasing the clamp pulls that point back over center, frees up the whole thing, and drags the other links with it. It's freaking magic. I wasn't sure if I'd bring these in for this video, or if I should wait for advanced, obvious mechanisms to come out. But if you've made it this far, it's time to unplug you from the matrix. From here on out, there is no spooning. Don't try to adjust your television. You are indeed looking at a plastic top with an integrated lid. None of that 2 parts box with a separate lid nonsense. We're 21 minutes into the future since you started this video, and in the future, everything is 1 part. Just have a look at that. Talk about elegance. I mean, where does the lid even end and the box begin? Right there at the hinge. But the hinge is molded in. It's part of it. Same piece of plastic as the rest, just maybe a little thinner at the bottom. And it does exactly what you'd expect thin plastic to do. It bends. But have a look at this one. Also 1 piece of plastic. However, well, that's different. That looks like it's going over center, and fabulously so at that. I'll cut to the chase here. If we look close, you'll notice 2 other little features on either side of that hinge. Symmetric features. Again, all one piece. They're just thin plastic webs of the same part. And while that one in the middle is acting like a hinge, the two on the sides, miraculously almost, are acting as springs. They have managed to make this, but out of one piece of plastic instead of 8 or 9 parts. I get shivers just saying it out loud. But that hinge in the middle, you see it? It's wide enough that it forces the lid to rotate around its axis. The thin webs of plastic on the sides are further out and further back from that axis because this lid is round. That means when the cap rotates around the hinge, the two thin webs need to move through a larger swing, a longer distance than the material in the hinge does, and that stretches them. Once they pass the top of that swing, the most stretch, they snap back, pulling the lid the other way. They snap over center. Have a look at this one. Much flatter profile on this lid. The back is almost straight, not as round as the other one. The webs on the side don't have as far to stretch, so the spring action, it's there, but it's a little weaker. That's not a bad flip top, but it's definitely not as satisfying as this one. If I'm being honest, it's a bit of a letdown. I'm man enough to admit that I've gone through entire bottles of shampoo in one shower just to be able to flip these tops just one more time. The nuances, though, depending on which specific cap you have in the shower, can sometimes get a bit complicated. Go have a real close look at a few flip tops of your own and maybe you'll see what I'm saying. Sometimes the thin webs go through what looks like oil canning, like snap through. They sort of buckle one way or the other. You know those poppers or whatever those toys are called that you turn inside out? You kind of put them on the table and then they slowly snap through and jump up in the air. Something like that. But when the web snaps through, it forces the lid a specific way. However your favorite flip top lids work, and let's be honest, we all have a favorite. There's one thing that's always amazed me even more than the fidget factor. All of these caps are injection molded. That means there's a mold, 2 halves, closes, they squirt the hot plastic in, it cools down, they open it, and the parts fall out. To mold a cap like this, it has to be done in the open position. So that's how it would sit in the tool. Cap straight back. So you have access to all of the features that you need to mold. Someone had to design a cap in the open position and cross their fingers for 6 to 8 weeks, maybe more, after they spent $500,000 of someone else's money to find out, after the cap was molded, if it would even close, let alone be snappy. That's so high of a pucker factor that, frankly, I refuse to believe it. Now, I've never been able to figure out who first invented these, in part due to the fact that I've never cared enough to look into it, but I like to believe someone was making a regular cap with a regular vanilla hinge, nothing fancy, no over center, no snap action, and business doing what business does best, probably ran that injection molding tool into the ground, making millions upon millions of caps, until the steel just wore out and the parts started to flash. Flash means the tool didn't quite close as cleanly as it did when it was new, usually because some steel is wearing away, or misalignment issues, but maybe you know what I'm talking about. You know those razor sharp edges on old cheap plastic coat hangers where the plastic starts to sort of seep out of the mold and create those sharp knife edges? Well, I bet that happened with the cap. I bet that flash started to create a web of material around the hinge, just a little, but enough to make some quality control tech notice the cap was snapping over. To notice that the cap was opening and closing by itself. Like any good machine operator or QC person, they hit the big red e-stop and they ran that part up to engineering, who then consequently took full credit for the design. Of course, I could be wrong. Maybe it was designed this way from day one, but I like my story better. And speaking of stories, I think that brings an end to ours. I don't know who this video was for, who needed to see it, or what they might do with it, but standing in the shower the other night, all pruny-handed and my wife screaming through the door not to finish the shampoo she literally just bought the day, right then and there, I knew this was a video I needed to make, perhaps so I could start the healing process. If you made it this far, I appreciate the company, and as always, thanks for watching.